Good evening, Congressman Sean Casten here. Thank you all for taking some time on a cold night to join us for our first telephone town hall of the new year. As usual, I want to give you a little overview on what's going on and then make time for your questions. If you would like to get in the queue for a question, you can press *3. And if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, press 1. This has been a really, really tough couple of weeks. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't want to cry on your shoulder, but I find myself lately thinking of, as I often do lately, thinking of Thomas Paine, who in 1776 said, "A man under the influence of servile, slavish, self-interested fear may be cruel, but he can never be brave." That was 1776. He wrote that. About the Tories who were pushing back against our founders and patriots who fought for independence. And in the past few weeks, I have spent far too much time dealing with people who are servile, slavish, self-interested, and cruel. Our week started in a classified briefing with Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Rubio that was ostensibly to tell us what they believed was the legal justification for the attacks in Venezuela. Obviously, this is a classified briefing, but I will tell you only that they did not even pretend to make legal justifications. They just candidly acted like children who were having fun playing with toys that make things go boom. It was offensive. I spent another part of this week talking with people on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, wondering what Congress could do to protect Jay Powell, and then, of course, hearings in the financial services hearing, because these are people who deeply care about making sure we have an independent Fed that's looking after the state of the economy, not the state of some politicians' polling. I called for the impeachment of Kristi Noem after watching the video of the murder of Renee Good in Minneapolis, and to be clear, we are trying to track how many people ICE has killed. That was the most gruesome and most public video. The rough count we have is we think we've identified 34 people that ICE has killed. I'm reading literally on Twitter right now that they may charge with homicide for a recent killing in El Paso in a detention center. This is an out-of-control agency that starts from the top. I spent time talking with my colleagues, Jason Crow and Chrissy Houlihan, about the increased security they're having to put up at their house to protect their children when they're away because of the attacks that are being made on them by Donald Trump, simply for saying that as veterans, as people who put their life in harm's way and who have served our country, reminding our troops that you do not have an obligation to obey an unlawful order. And then last night, I was at the Danish embassy meeting with the diplomatic delegation that had come over from Denmark, along with the leaders in Greenland, which is, of course, part of the Republic of Denmark. And they were giving us a readout on the meeting they had supposed to be with Secretary Rubio. They said they found it on the way into the meeting that Vice President Vance would also be there. They had not been prepared for that. The head of the Greenland delegation told me that children in Greenland are not able to sleep at night because they're reading things that the President of the United States says, and they wonder if they're going to be attacked tomorrow. And I said to him as we were talking, and here we're there. This is a diplomatic effort. We're trying to remind the Danish and the Greenlanders that we're their friends. I should stress this was a very bipartisan group of members. Which was good, and it was important that this was a bipartisan group of members. There were about 20 of us there at that dinner. But I said to the guy from Greenland, I'm a pretty patriotic guy, and I've never felt less proud to be an American than to hear your stories. And the only solace I can give you is that I understand the pain that those children feel, because we get calls from my own constituents in Chicago whose own kids are wondering whether they can sleep at night. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Going back to Thomas Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. But I do want to, at least hopefully give you a little bit of context, and not false hope, but hope nonetheless. Go back to what I said at the start. A man under the influence of servile, slavish, self-interested fear may be cruel, but can never be brave. These atrocities that are being committed by the White House really started amping up after the vote on the Jeffrey Epstein files. And what's happened because of the pressure we've put on in the House and the Senate, frankly, because of the pressure that's happened all over the country with these No Kings rallies, with the insistence on I mean, my goodness, just saying that pedophilia is bad. That created the first time in this Congress that an overwhelming majority of the Republicans in the House and the Senate, it was unanimous in the Senate and unanimous but for one vote in the House on the Epstein files, that those members stood up to Donald Trump as a matter of principle, and were safe. They didn't suddenly have the Proud Boys showing up at their house. They didn't suddenly get threats to being primaried. And at some level that shouldn't be tremendously courageous, but I respect that there is political courage in standing up to the leader of your own party, especially when the leader of your party is someone who has such a vindictive streak. There's a direct link between the vote on the Epstein files and then subsequently the fact that we got 17 Republicans to vote with us to extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies. That's a big deal. That's the first time, I believe, since Obamacare was passed that we got any Republicans to vote on it, much less such a strong majority. That's really good for people's health care. It's really good for America. It's really good for the Congress, that the Congress is pushing back and saying we're going to vote our values, not just our party. That same rising pushback is why we are now passing fairly solid, fairly bipartisan funding bills. We're going to sail into a shutdown on the government in January 30th if we don't pass them. We haven't passed any bipartisan funding bills since Nancy Pelosi was Speaker. It's been culture war stuff, and we've been passing continuing resolutions. We're not passing anything at all and shutting down the government. To be fair, I personally haven't voted for all those bills, but the bills have been largely devoid of the really partisan culture war stuff. They've included checks on the president. They've rolled back, reinstituted a lot of the unconstitutional cuts that were implemented by DOJ. This is a statement of principle standing up to the president, and that's important. All of that is creating a lot of fear in the White House. And a man under the influence of servile, slavish, self-interested fear may be cruel, but he can never be brave. That cruelty is the result of that. The president is afraid. He may be cruel, but he will never be brave. And I think our collective responsibility as people in public service, as people in the private sector, as people who love our country, is to keep that pressure on, not for our political preferences, but that pressure on to insist on preservation of the rule of law, that pressure on to insist on preservation of democracy, that pressure to insist on decency. Because as long as we have those guardrails, we can have all sorts of political debates that are healthy and constructive within those guardrails. If we lose those guardrails, we have no opportunity for any debate at all anymore. And as we sail into our 250th birthday, I'd rather be on the right side of fighting for that rather than on the side of those servile Tories. With that in mind, I think I certainly we hear from you. We do our best to address your concerns. As you have help, please let us know. I love the fact that we're able to help when we can. It saddens me that we are too often frustrated by the executive branch and not being able to do more. But before I open for your questions, and again, *3 if you'd like to ask a question, press 1 if you'd like to get the newsletter. I will just leave you with one bit of uplift that again is from this same 1776 Thomas Paine article. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation. What we obtain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. It would be strange if so celestial a thing as freedom should not be highly rated. We can't obtain it cheaply, but we can't esteem it enough. These are old-timey words, I've realized, but I'm going to take them. I'm going to quote them exactly and not try to update it. So thanks for listening in. I hope that context is useful. I hope I haven't brought you down too much, but I don't want to sugarcoat the reality we're in. And with that, we will open up for your questions. *3 to get in the queue, 1 to subscribe to our newsletter.
Perfect. Our first question comes from Jamie in Westmont. Jamie, you are now live.
Good evening, Jamie.
Hi, Congressman. First, I want to thank you because I think you're absolutely wonderful, and I love that you take the time to do this, and you're honest and upfront. I'm literally beside myself what this evil man is doing to this country. And the two things that, besides ICE murdering people on the street, the two things that have really scared me is the fact that he's essentially taking over Venezuela and threatening to take over Greenland. Now, I read today that some of the European countries are sending troops to Greenland, and I'm so happy to hear that. But I don't understand how any Republican in the House or Senate can sit by and let this man call himself the acting leader of Venezuela and threaten to take Greenland by force and think this is all okay. It's beyond me how anybody can think this is okay. And I'm just wondering what kind of conversations you have with these people who are blind. I don't get it.
Well, I always, number one, thank you for praising me for being honest. As Alyssa Slotkin often jokes, we've entered a line of work where you get credit for jumping over very low bars, but I'll keep jumping over them. I want to be careful not to speculate on other people's motives. I do want to stress what I said, that we had, I didn't do an exact count, but I think we probably had 20 or 25 members of Congress at the Danish embassy last night, and I'm going to guess it was probably 6 or 7 Republicans. That's significant, right? And it matters. It matters for where they are. It also matters for Denmark to see that this may be a bad person, but this is not a bad country, and I think that's important for them to see. With respect to Venezuela, I don't want to telegraph too much, but I think it is safe to say that even in the most charitable reading of the legal authorities, that the White House believes they have, both for the attacks on the Venezuelan boats in international waters and for the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, they have not indicated any legal authority to claim the assets of a sovereign nation. And I think part of what you're seeing, setting aside what politicians may be saying about this, part of what you're seeing from the meeting with the oil executives in the White House this week is that they don't really want to get in a situation where a company that currently owes $200 billion to their creditors, the largest of those creditors being China, that they find themselves basically in a fraudulent conveyance lawsuit at the World Trade Organization or the IMF because some country who didn't have title to Venezuelan assets sold it to them, and now they have to go get in a fight with China. So I think the White House is overplaying their hand there, which is not to say that there aren't legitimate constitutional issues, but I think they're overplaying their hand. With respect to Greenland, I want to just give you a little bit of context for how the risk of what blows back on us. I don't want to say that I'm happy that Europeans are mobilizing their military out of fear of an attack from the United States. That is a real problem, right? And I understand that's not what you meant, Jamie, but we should be concerned about that. The Europeans are doing that because they, like us, are members of NATO. And Article 5 of NATO says that an attack on one NATO member will be defended by all NATO members. We never contemplated that one NATO member would be threatening attacking another NATO member. But that is why the Europeans are mobilizing, because they have treaty obligations to each other, and one of their partners is violating their treaty obligations. One of the things that the Danes told us last night, or reminded us of, I should say, is that the Danish have been allies of the United States for 220 years. Every time we have gotten into a war where we asked for help from our allies, the Danes have been there. The Danes served side by side with American soldiers in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. The Danish people lost as many of their soldiers per capita as we did in Afghanistan. And in talking with them last night, these are friends. I mean, my name Casten is shortened from Castensen. My roots are Danish. Right? These are people who are sitting there saying, how do I go back to the people who I represent and say, you lost your child fighting a war for the benefit of the United States? How do you have that conversation right now? And what does that mean for the United States next time we find ourselves in a situation like 9/11, when we're calling on our allies to help us? What happens if they don't show up? How many of our own young men and women end up being put in harm's way because our allies no longer trust us? So this is not just about some dumb idea about Greenland. This is about making sure that we as America remain strong, that we as America remain trusted. These are. Trying to be careful about how much I share, but there are Chinese and Russian troops all over the North Atlantic. We share intelligence with our allies. If the United States is threatening to invade a European country, why should they share their intelligence with us? Think about that. And there are Republicans who understand that. I was glad that a handful of them showed up last night.
Our next question comes from Teresa in Oak Lawn. Teresa, you are now live.
Hi, Teresa.
Good evening, Representative Casten. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing this presentation. And first of all, I wanted to, before asking my question, to thank you for addressing the Greenland and Venezuela question. What scares me the most is that even though you said that some of the Republican senators and representatives joined you last night, it's a shame that many more did not, because they should know the implications and ramifications of not being present at those discussions. They have been in their offices for many, many years, and they should know the implications of not being true allies in possibly impeding the attack on allies who have been our allies for many years. I am a person who studied political science. I have degrees in political science. So I understand what you are saying, and I understand the things that you cannot get into further discussion about. It is shameful, absolutely shameful, what Donald Trump is doing. He is clearly showing that he has no common sense, let alone any political or foreign policy understanding. I don't understand how the heck he got into office, but that's another question. My original question to you was, what can we do to stop him from continuing to murder American citizens and continue to destroy what's happening from across the nation by attacking American citizens as well as individuals who are here and not being representative of what he is supposedly saying he's attacking or trying to arrest, which are these so-called criminals, because the people that he is having his ICE and CBP control.
Gotcha. So I got the question, Teresa. I do just want to clarify one point, because I don't. And look, I'm happy to be very critical of my colleagues when I think they deserve it. But I wouldn't make too much of the fact that we had 25 people at a dinner and 7 were Republicans on my rough count, just as I sit here right now. This was a fairly short notice dinner that came through. Members of Congress have, we all have crazy schedules. I got the notice that this dinner was going on, and there were slots, sort of first come first served basis, probably at about noon yesterday, and juggled some things on my schedule. I'm sure every other member of Congress did it, so I wouldn't read much into the ratio that was there. I think there's a solid number of people, on both sides of the aisle who I'm sure would like to attend. With respect to your question, I really think that and I don't want to put anybody in the kind of risk that Renee Good found herself in, but I also want to point out to anybody that what Renee Good was doing was perfectly legal. What scared them was that what she was doing was legal. And so I think it is really, really critically important to continue to be present, to lead with love. They're looking for someone to provoke violence, to trigger martial law. Don't fall into that trap. Model the behavior you expect to see. But it makes a difference that these things are being documented. We organized a shadow hearing, which is to say a hearing not blessed by the Speaker of the House, but you have some powers and minority, in Chicago, specifically on what's going on in ICE. And we had a number of lawyers there who were saying that they are increasingly finding more and more judges who are not giving the Department of Justice the benefit of the doubt when they make statements in court about what happened at the scene of one of these alleged crimes, because they're seeing so much evidence that's contradicting what the Department of Justice has said. Now, it's a problem that courts don't believe that the Department of Justice is acting in good faith, but the ability to succeed in those courts is a direct function of all this righteous civic action on the ground. We're seeing Brett Kavanaugh, of all people, having second thoughts, because ever since he wrote the order that said that ICE could legally detain people just because of the color of their skin or they have an accent that make an officer might maybe think they're an immigrant, people have started to refer to those as Kavanaugh stops. Kavanaugh does not like his name being tied to what is obviously a gross violation of everything we're proud of as Americans, and he's starting to you can see in some of his recent rulings sort of backpedaling on that. Again, that's because of civic action that these people are moving. They are responsive to that public pressure. And again, I'm not asking anybody to be a martyr, but be out there, be present. The No Kings rallies matter. These are people who are motivated by fear. They are dangerous because they are afraid. But remember, for those of you who are a little bit older than me, once Nixon's poll numbers fell far enough, his party turned on him and he resigned. We are not quite to that level of polling, but we're within spitting distance at this point. Thanks, Teresa.
Our next question comes from Tim in Downers Grove. Tim, you are now live.
Hello, Tim.
Hello. Thank you for taking your time. You kind of answered the first part of my question. I guess what it initially was is when you've got an administration who, in my opinion, and from what I can see, blatantly lies and doesn't really adhere to the common laws and Constitution, what do we do other than the protests and try to put enough political pressure? But then B, if I can add one more to that, moving forward, are there any sort of discussions? Because my real concern is that the Supreme Court is swayed so conservative that is not really representative of the entire U.S. Any discussions about expanding the Supreme Court to make it more representative of what we truly feel as a country?
So you have picked an issue that is near and dear to my own heart, Tim, because I think these are all fixable, and and I'm just going to wax a little bit historical here. The first election that we could ever have in the United States, the first vote we had in these United States was the vote to ratify the Constitution. The people who were allowed to vote in that election were white property-holding men. Most of the states also required that you be Christian. The best estimates that have been done is that perhaps 6% of the population of the country at that time was eligible to vote. And they set rules, including the nature of the Supreme Court and the structure of our government, that accrued to the benefit of those people who were setting the rules, right? That's understandable. We have gotten better over time as a country because we have gradually expanded democracy to include more people. We're not all the way done yet, and we still have these, I would argue, sort of archaic institutions that are not responsive to public will, but were designed because the folks who could vote in those first early elections were trying to protect people who had interests that were common to theirs. And there are discussions about expanding the court. I'm certainly open to those. There are discussions about term limits. I'm certainly open to those. There's some complications in the Constitution around that. What I've been pushing my colleagues for, and in some cases have introduced legislation, is I think there's things we can do much quicker. It takes a long time to expand the court because you have to have a president and a Senate who has different values than the court for that to matter. It takes a long time for term limits to take effect for obvious reasons. But we can do things right away. As an example, the Supreme Court right now gets to select their docket of what cases they hear. That's the result of a congressional action, I think it's 1929 Judges Act. The docket used to be set outside of the Supreme Court. What Congress giveth, Congress can taketh away. Article 3 of the Constitution says that the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, the things that the Supreme Court hears independent of the other courts, is specifically limited to matters relating to ambassadors, maritime law, disputes between the states, and such appellate jurisdiction as Congress grants. So Congress has the power to reduce or completely eliminate the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction, and we could create another appellate body. I've introduced legislation to do that. I happen to think that Brett Kavanaugh is really good at legal matters relating to ambassadors and maritime law. Not wild about his opinions on other subjects. The other thing, and we can't do this with the current majority in the House, but we could with a slight change. We have the power of the purse. It is completely within Congress's power to say we are going to provide you with substantially fewer financial resources than you need until such time as you adopt, I don't know, some ethics reforms, right? With some accountability. We could do all those things right away that don't have to wait for justices to retire or hit term limits or another president to come in. And I think all of those things, even if we succeeded, would be great. Even if we don't succeed, I think signaling that the Article 1 branch will not tolerate taking power away from us without taking some of that power back, I think would create a healthier Supreme Court that shrunk down to maybe fit a little better in their britches. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Our next question comes from Travis in Darien. Travis, you are now live.
Hi, Travis.
Hey, Sean. How you doing, buddy? Good to talk to you again, man.
Pleasure.
So I got a question about the Epstein files and the batch of files that's supposed to be released. If I'm not wrong, they were supposed to be released a few days back. And if they do not release them, what is the House's intentions and what is the next step in forcing the full release, even though they have in quotations, 1 million new documents to review?
So the full release is required by law. That was a law that was voted on by every member of the House except for Clay Higgins of Louisiana, if you're keeping score at home, was then approved unanimously by the Senate and was then signed into law by Donald Trump. That is the law of the land. and the White House and the Department of Justice are now breaking the law. The legislative branch writes the laws, we legislate. The executive branch is expected to execute the laws, and if they fail to execute the laws, the responsibility falls on the judicial branch to enforce them. Now, in the normal course, you would expect to have an independent attorney general who is enforcing the law. Pam Bondi is not that person. And so Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey, who, of course, initiated the discharge petition that ultimately forced that release, are in the process of preparing litigation on behalf of the House. I don't know, honestly, off the top. I know they were working on it this week. I don't know if they've finalized it and released it or it's in the process. But that is the next step now, is to file suit from the legislative branch to try to get the courts to enforce and compel. All of that is almost so mechanical and mundane that I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the President of the United States is in violation of the laws of the United States, and we are counting on the courts to hold him and the Attorney General accountable. That is a really big deal. I don't want to trivialize that in any way, but if we remain committed to the rule of law, as I would suggest we have to, or we sink to their level, we now are in this process that we have to go through. I don't want to say you will. You may continue to see some releases because we have in parallel, through the work on the Oversight Committee, successfully subpoenaed the Epstein estate for a number of files. So things like that horrible poem and cartoon that came out, that was actually released through the subpoena of the Epstein estate, not the compulsory release of the Department of Justice investigation and these million files. So there are multiple channels of documents that are coming out, but all of the blocking of these documents that's being done is illegal, and we're doing what's in our power as a legislative branch to push them, but because we have a government of checks and balances, I don't have as much power as I would like to, and that's, in some cases, perhaps a good thing.
Great. Our next question comes from Lisa in Lombard. Lisa, you are now live.
Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Representative Casten. My question is about the articles of impeachment that Representative Robin Kelly submitted today. On the news, it said that there were 70 other reps on board. I was wondering if you were one of those, and if not, why? And if so, what are you doing to help her get enough votes, especially on the Republican side, to impeach Kristi Noem?
So yes, I am on one of the 70 who signed on to that. This is Robin's legislation, and so she's really in charge of what the process is to go through and get this done next. I think the odds of getting our Republican colleagues to sign on to this are slim to none at this point. This is not something I'm particularly proud of, but it just is what it is. I've impeached Donald Trump twice. That means that I have been personally involved in half the impeachments that have ever taken place in our country. In both of those cases, we successfully impeached the president in the House. And in both of those cases, we failed to remove him in the Senate. And the goal is not to impeach. The goal is to remove Kristi Noem. We are not going to be safer. And Congresswoman Kelly, has done a really good job in her articles of impeachment of making it clear that there's a whole litany of abuses. There's failing to respond to congressional oversight. There's the withholding of FEMA funds from American citizens who've been struck by natural disasters, and indeed the situation in Minneapolis. The way that an impeachment works, if it's going to work, is you need to have really an impeachment is like a grand jury indictment. It's not the conviction, but you want to make sure that you have all your facts in a row so that you are prepared to convict. Because once you impeach, the next step is the Speaker of the House appoints impeachment managers to go to the Senate and run the trial. You may recall Jamie Raskin headed the impeachment committee, the second Trump impeachment. Adam Schiff did the first Trump impeachment. Mike Johnson would be the person deciding who the impeachment managers would be if we were to impeach Kristi Noem tomorrow. And if you want to open up a whole can of mischief, imagine what happens if he appointed, I don't know, Jim Jordan to run that process. So what I think, and I've talked a little bit with Robin about this, but this will be her call, is what we really need to find a way to do is to force one of the committees of jurisdiction in the House to conduct what's called an impeachment inquiry before we actually vote on the impeachment measure, so that we could get those facts out. And there are some procedural tools that can be used to try to force that. Ultimately, we can't force that without a majority of the members of the House voting. And so, the work right now is really to lay the groundwork to build the case. Please help where you can, but to try to get to a point where we could force what's called a motion to refer, where you would refer this to the relevant committee, and then that committee would then be compelled by the House, if we had the votes, to go and start doing a proper impeachment inquiry and build the case, so that once we get to the Senate, we have the strongest possible hand. Thanks, Lisa. Again, star 3 to get in the queue, 1 to subscribe to our newsletter.
Yes. Our next question comes from Ruth Ann in LaGrange Highlands. Ruth Ann, you are now live.
Hello, Ruth Ann.
Hi. Thank you for doing this evening.
Of course.
So my question, and I understand, we unfortunately do not have the votes or the patriots to impeach Kristi Noem or to impeach Donald Trump at this time. What we may have, however, is the Department of Homeland Security bill that has to pass the Senate by January 30th, or ICE potentially loses at least partial funds for their 2026, or however long we can potentially stall, take out, remove any provisions that allows ICE to have their $28 billion budget. What pressures can you put on Republicans and potentially any Democrats who are willing to vote for this bill and say, yes, we can just give ICE their $28 billion, and if they don't have the funds to go after American citizens, they're not going to do it for free?
Great question, Ruth Ann. I must say, this is one of these town halls where I sit here and thinking I either have the most well-educated constituents who are so well informed on everything going on in our politics and appropriations process, or we're just getting a lucky selection on the calls. But you are absolutely right. When I mentioned in my opening remarks that we have done, really for the first time since Nancy Pelosi, a good job of passing bipartisan funding bills, the overall appropriations for government requires 12 distinct funding bills to pass. There's one for labor and health and human services. There's one for state and foreign operations. Each one is a separate title. We have marched through in the House, I believe, either 5 or 6 of them. I should know that number better because we just voted on a couple this week. We have generally done the easy ones and then getting closer and closer to the hard ones as you get done. I think the Senate has now passed 3 of those bills, and the hardest bill is going to be the Homeland Security bill that you talked about. What quite a few of us have been doing, within the Democratic caucus is saying, look, we appreciate that we have got the leverage to take out some of these horrible culture war writers, all sorts of stuff that's just anti-women, anti-LGBT. We've gotten all those things stripped out. We have succeeded in putting a lot more oversight, things that shouldn't matter, but they do. we stripped all references to the Trump Kennedy Center. So now it just says the Kennedy Center, and there's no confusion about that. Those things matter. As it sits right now, I don't have a whip count, but there's enough of us who have informed Democratic leadership that we will vote no on anything that doesn't substantially curtail funding for ICE, at least back to the levels it was before this gross expansion in the big ugly bill, and maybe sort of but certainly these both have to be there, some real meaningful oversight and accountability. As it sits right now, I don't know that there is a Venn diagram between a Homeland Security funding package that would gain enough Democratic support to make that the kind of bipartisan bill that can get through. Because in the Senate, of course, it's a tougher process, so you have to have Senate support as well. Chris Murphy in the Senate has been taking the lead on making that same point. I don't know if there's an overlap between the one that gets the necessary Democratic support with the kind of controls we need on ICE and gets the Republicans. And what we're trying to figure out right now is if we get to September 30th and that isn't funded, we either completely shut that down. And for all the horrors of ICE, we still want border security. We still want to have, TSA. We want to have the drug sniffing dogs. You don't want to totally shut that down. But the protocol is, if you don't have the appropriations funded, do you do a continuing resolution that just continues at current levels? And the current levels are terrible. So we're sitting there with no good options right now other than to use every ounce of leverage we have. And I think we're all a little bit on tippy toes going into the next 2 weeks to see how we resolve that issue. But that's the one piece of the appropriations package that is going to be a fight for all the reasons that you raised.
Our next question comes from Terry in Downers Grove. Terry, you are now live.
Hi, Terry.
Hi, Sean. So I want to talk about something a little bit more domestic than some of the policies that we've been talking about so far. We have an administration that is doing everything in its power to undermine the faith of the American people and citizens in government, in bureaucracy, and in government service. And the area that I see as particularly needy and as an area that's being ignored by many of our representatives is the Postal Service. It's established political theory. I'm sure everybody knows that people's impression of the government is formed by the people in the government that they deal with. Almost every citizen in this country deals with post office. Their mailman, their post office box, where they get their medicine, where they get their bills. And the current administration, as DeJoy as their representative, and his continued suffocation of our postal service is damaging everyone in this country, particularly people in rural areas. Maybe they can't get UPS for their meds. A lot of people depend on the Postal Service for even still their money and their drugs and their bills. And I feel like this is an issue that, when DeJoy was first appointed, everybody was all up in arms, but everybody's kind of just let it slide. And I feel like this is a real problem on so many levels. Our post office, which you may be aware of since you also live in Downers Grove, didn't have any stamps in November and December. No stamps.
Yeah, nor did Jewel.
Nor did Jewel. Yeah. So there have been notices of people who that they will no longer hold mail. For people
Terry,
who are traveling.
I just want to respectful.
Not
What's your
only
question?
not only that, but we had mail delivered after 8 o'clock at night. Our postal workers are working after dark in January and December in ice and snow. It's not safe. And I want to know what you and your fellow representatives are doing to address this. I feel like it's being ignored.
Got the question. Let me tell you where we're at, and you're right about the concerns. So we had in the I think this was the last session. Certainly wasn't this session. We did successfully address some really goofy stuff in the Postal Service pension system to eliminate some of the financial issues that they had. It had to do with it was an accounting issue with how they were forced to reserve for pensions, but was going to basically blow up the ability of the post office to work. That was successful. We have successfully fought back, but the fight continues. A number of the efforts to try to privatize the post office and to make sure that we maintain 6-day delivery. My own, as Laura here knows well, my own letter carrier is very active and keeps us very well informed on some of the issues within Downers Grove and beyond. The push right now, and a part of the reason why you're seeing so many people doing late deliveries, is there's been this effort to consolidate a number of the postal facilities. And look, it's appropriate. Like, sometimes you need to streamline, and you should look at these things. Given the where the mail volume is, is your processing center in the right place? Can you consolidate a couple centers? It's not unilaterally bad to go through that consolidation, but we're getting to a point, as evidenced by the fact that you see your letter carrier out late at night, where in order for these folks to meet their appointed rounds, they're having to drive longer in the morning to pick up the mail and then drive longer to get to your house, and they still got the same amount of mail in the truck, but now it takes them longer to go get that done. And on top of that, they've had some it's been hard for them to, particularly after COVID, to attract the labor force they need to continue to do this. We've done the things we can legislatively. This is one of these areas where, because the post office is independent and is self-funded, there are more degrees of freedom that the executive branch has over that agency than they do over some other places. And so we can make a lot of noise, but we can't fire DeJoy. That's the decision of the board, and the board gets appointed by the president. And we have fewer legal degrees of freedom there. The protection we have, such as it is that when you have a president with collapsing popularity numbers, everybody gets the mail. Lots and lots of seniors depend on the post office to deliver medications that they need on a regular basis, in some cases that are appropriately temperature controlled and humidity controlled. And if you want to be really, really unpopular, tamper with the Postal Service. And so there is a certain political pressure that's there. We continue to do what we can. I'm actually meeting with Mark, my letter carrier, and the local shop steward, I think next week, Laura, to go through and get the latest on what's going on. So we're very active on it. I've lost track of how many labor interactions we've gone to. We actually went with all the postal workers and stood out when DeJoy came out to Oak Brook recently to get in some good trouble. But there are more degrees of freedom there than I wish they had.
Our next question comes from Ken in Lisle. Ken, you are now live.
Hello, Ken.
Hello, Sean. Thanks for taking my call. Must be frustrating, especially the last 12 months in Washington, and I appreciate your efforts. My question or comment, a combination of both, is we have the midterms coming up in 10 months. What authority does Trump have to call them off, which I'm thinking somehow he's going to try to do that? And the other thing is, if we do have midterms, how honest will they be? To use Trump's word, will they be rigged in his favor? So I'm really concerned about the midterms coming up. I just don't think they're going to be, maybe even happen, or they may not be fair and honest. What do you think?
So, let me start with the good news. It is virtually impossible to rig an election, at least after the voting has happened. And I say that, if anybody in the call has ever acted as an election judge, you understand how complicated this is. There's a different ballot in every precinct, because you and I might live right next door to each other, but maybe the line for a judicial district cuts between our houses, and so I have a slightly different ballot than you do. The Constitution is very clear that states set the manner and place of elections, and even below the state level, the counties have substantial control over how you can vote. So, for example, in DuPage, we've set up rules where you can vote anywhere in DuPage, and it's a computer-controlled process where you can show up. I think last cycle I went to Elmhurst to vote, and I gave them my name. They pulled up my ballot that was specific to my house and my vote, and the person next to me was, I don't know, maybe they were from Addison, but they could pull in the same ballot. Cook County doesn't run their elections that way. In Cook County, you've got to go closer to your precinct. I mention all that because it's virtually impossible to come in from the top down and say, I want to start changing the way that these votes are done, because they're different voting systems, they're different voting timing. You don't know who's going to show up where and vote. Some of them are punch systems, some of them are electronic. So that part I'm not worried about. The part that I do think we need to be ever vigilant about is what we've had to be vigilant about more or less since 1776. That everybody who has ever wanted to tamper with an election in this country has done so by suppressing the ability of certain groups to show up in the election. The worst stories, of course, are through the Jim Crow era, when black bodies were literally killed and left outside polling places to make it clear that some people were going to be threatened with physical violence if they voted. Poll tests, literacy tests. Et cetera, et cetera. As recently as, I think Eric Holder told us that in 2022, not that long ago, the average white person in America waited online 6 minutes to vote, and the average black person in America 50 minutes, 50, in line to vote. That is not by accident. It's because there are more polling places in some places than others. There's more polling machines in some places than others. I think you have to assume that this White House will play that trick because it's been proven to work. I think some of what they're doing in the tampering, the last question about the mail, if I can slow down the mail on election day and all of a sudden mail-in ballots don't arrive in time, that's a way to manipulate an election that make it very hard. One of the fears that I think we should have with a lot of this ICE pushback is it is not coincidental that they are sending these troops into heavily minority neighborhoods. We had Ilhan Omar from Minnesota made us cry at caucus this week because she said, as someone who was born in Somalia, I came to the United States because I was tired of living in a country where people from the government could randomly show up and ask me for my papers at any time. I just wanted to go where I could walk around and be free. And now you've got people in Minneapolis who are having to face the same thing. The reason they came to America was to avoid that. But one of the things she pointed out is, as much as they're making us think about the Somalis, she said, you look at where the ICE troops are and who they're arresting in Minneapolis, they're pretty Hispanic. This is an intentional, let's intimidate folks not to vote. That is not good, right? They will play that trick. The only solace that I can give you is the solace that Stacey Abrams shared with us a couple of years at caucus, and she was telling us all these stories. I'm basically just telling you what she told me. And she looked out at a lot of our faces as we were getting more and more scared, and she stopped and she said, I see a lot of white people who seem really shocked by this. And she goes, to be clear, we're not going from 100 to 45. We're going from 55 to 45. Our country's been doing this for a long time. There's a lot of communities who should not have to expect this, but have come to expect it and have come to accommodate it, and they show up and they stand in those lines anyway. They shouldn't have to do that, but this will be an important election to make sure that you exercise your right to vote, to vote early and make sure that you're not counting on this at the 11th hour. Because at the end of the day, as Madison said, you can't guarantee that we will only be served by virtuous leaders. So we have to trust in the virtue of the people who select them.
Our next question comes from Rebecca in Chicago. Rebecca, you are now live.
Hello, Rebecca.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking my question. This is my first time being in one of these town halls, and I just want to say I've been really moved by your opening comments and by the commitment you have to represent us and to provide this kind of forum for feedback. The question that I have is about foreign affairs, and going back to your comments on the situation with Denmark and Greenland, it made me think about the war in Gaza. And even though there's been new headlines, the war in Gaza is still ongoing, and it's been on the hearts and minds of many of us. And, I think there's some parallels with the situation in Greenland. Israel has, along with the U.S., has talked about annexing Gaza and the West Bank as well. And, there've been, talk from Trump about like a luxury beachside resort area in Gaza after, however many decades it takes to clear out the rubble. And, I guess my larger question that I have is how do we make sure the situation in Gaza doesn't fade from public view, especially given that, I think a difference with Denmark and Greenland is that here, there Trump is acting against our allies, as you explained, but in Israel, the U.S. is aligned with Israel's plans, but at the same time, there's just been, really compelling and mounting criticism of Israel committing violations of international law. And so it is a bit of a different situation, but I'd like to hear your comments on it. And one last thing, which is just, I think one of the most devastating things as I think about it is that the borders have been almost completely closed for coming up on 2 years. And there are some people who've been evacuated for medical needs and things like that. But by and large, people really haven't been able to escape. And I can't think of any other war zone where people can't get out, even if they're desperately trying to. So I think my most immediate concern is how do we even get the borders open? So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for the question. So this is a weird thing, as you've probably gathered from my tone, I am not one to praise Donald Trump. I think we have a strange opportunity right now that a number of us are trying to capitalize on, and we're finalizing. So I don't want to telegraph this too much, but just share with you how we're thinking about this and what I think, to give you some sense of where we're going. Because Trump got Netanyahu and Hamas to agree to this ceasefire agreement, you now have an agreement that the U.S. is a broker to. Not a perfect agreement. Nothing in the Middle East ever is perfect. But that agreement, among other things, says there has to be a Palestinian government that's governing the area. There has to be a security force that's providing appropriate security that's not run by the IDF. There has to be appropriate humanitarian aid to restore dignity and food and all the sorts of things that you need there. That means you have to have ultimately a path to a Palestinian state with borders that are, kind of have to look something like 1967. We'll get into the whole sort of, right of return and land swaps and everything else. But that gives us, I think, congressionally, the ability to go to Trump and say, okay, this deal that you signed, let's put some conditions to make sure that if anybody violates these conditions, there's some accountability, because you were the great master negotiator who signed this deal. And I'm not saying that deal has been perfectly met since it was signed, but there has been substantially more food that's come in. That's from a very low baseline. But it is improving. There has been some initial conversations around trying to set up whoever this sort of future Palestinian Authority could be. We, like my office, has been very active in pushing to shut down the settler violence in the West Bank. We successfully got the Biden White House to impose international financial sanctions on some of the worst of the settlers who were basically living in areas where they should not be living under the Oslo Accords and are stealing land from Palestinians, in some cases killing Palestinians. We were able to get the Biden administration to box those people out of the financial network so they couldn't fund those operations. Trump reversed that. We got to fix that because you can't have a path to a viable Palestinian Authority if people who are living in the Palestinian territories are unable to travel freely and meet with people and have something like this conversation we're having right now. So I think we've got some opportunities to keep some attention on that and to frame it in a way where Trump can have some ownership on it. No promises, but that's at least how our office is thinking about it, as ways that I think we can maybe try to make, as you say, not lose sight of this and get it back. One last thing that I'll just tell you: when that horrific video came out from Trump, saying that he wanted to turn Gaza into a beach resort, we immediately put together a letter and was very intentional. I got one of my colleagues, Brad Sherman from California, who has a reputation of being much more sort of, shall we say, sort of unilaterally supportive of the Israeli government than I've been. And I worked with him to come up with a letter that basically said we need to get as many members as possible, looking at the two of us on this letter as being people who are going to play it down the middle and make it clear this is unacceptable. I think Brad and I got about 100 members of Congress to join that letter, and it sort of became this is I don't want to say it's funny because it's very dark humor, but we got to a point where I was going around the floor and people were saying, "What's this letter I'm talking about? What does the letter say?" And I said, "Here's the short version of the letter. Nothing good happens when you kick people out of the Levant. If you don't know why, read any book written in the last 3,000 years. There's a long history there. Let's not repeat the same damn mistake." And that argument resonated at the time, but we got to keep making it.
So we are over the hour, so I will
goodness.
turn it back to you for your closing remarks.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for joining. I meant what I said before. I'm privileged to represent such good people. I'm privileged to represent such patriotic people who are thoughtful. And I guess I'll close by sharing with you what I shared with our Danish friends last night, that the American people are fundamentally good. The American people are fundamentally decent. Not everybody votes the same way that we do, but have faith in the decency of the American people. Because we are better than the person representing us. For those of you who follow me on Twitter for a long time, the pinned tweet, I will keep calling it Twitter to my grave. The pinned tweet I have is Frederick Douglass, who says that the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins, and he her worst enemy who seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend under the specious garb of patriotism. So thank you all for being true patriots. Good night.